Big choices. Hi guys. So first of all, thank you for coming out. I know lots of you come from different parts of the world, coming in, and welcome to Paris to launch ECC with a very, very intense 2 days on stablecoins. Actually, I believe it's one of the most perfect places to have this kind of talk. If you know a little bit about the history of France, we have La Monnaie de Paris, where you have 1/3 of the minting of the money for the whole of the European region, which is actually minted here in Paris. So before we start delving into worldwide schemes and CBDCs and stablecoin across borders, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. So on my left, we have Xavier Levaisser, which is CEO of Econ and also advisor on CBDC implementation and writer of various papers on the subject. Then Tiana I'm really sorry, Tiana. Thank you very much. Tiana Baker-Taylor, that's on me, who is VP Regulation at Circle and in charge of regulations and strategies. And Julien Bouteloup, who is CEO of many different ventures. For example, Blackpool, so many of them, Stake Capital Group, Stake DAO, and core team advisor at Curve. So coming from my experience as commission right on global digital governance standards, I'd like for us to remember that the first usage of money, digital or otherwise, was essentially to replace barter. Now, the first currency, the Mesopotamian shekel, came into play 5000 BC when they found themselves needing to barter with Mesopotamians and Babylonians. Now, coming from Mesopotamia to make a Taoist Dai and going through the Chinese crypto yuan, there are as many different ideological cultures and opinions that need to translate into cross-border barter. But before we focus on the friction points of cross-border monetary translation, Xavier, can you redefine where we are between central bank digital currencies and stablecoins?
So hello everyone, really happy to be here and congrats on organizing all this event. It's been super interesting and also we had a perfect talk just before introducing also very interesting research on this topic. On CBDC, just to have the view, you all know that all of this is happening because of stablecoins and particularly also Diem a couple of years ago that really shook central banks. I think one thing that's happening is central banks are realizing that they need to provide money everywhere because they still are the one that provide the reference. We have discussed this yesterday. You've heard some conversation about even stablecoin are still denominated in fiat currencies. So in a sense, they are still picking back on these ideas. And so the CBDCs is just a money that's issued directly by the central bank, but there is nothing new in that. They already do some form of digital money in their systems. What's new is they are inspired by what's happening in blockchain and trying to make it a little bit easier to access it, to exchange it, and to move it around. And they are doing many experiments in this. So I know in the crypto ecosystem there is often a negative view, but in my view it's really, at the moment, really cautiously trying every declination of what's happening in crypto to provide what's their role to provide money.
Thank you very much, Xavier. So Tiana, operating at your level at Circle, can you underline stablecoin use cases and pick one of your favorite 5 CBDCs that are currently in usage?
So what was the beginning of the question?
If you could underline stablecoin use cases from your experience at Circle. I think you've seen quite a few.
Sure. So as Jim was saying earlier, we're seeing a gross increase in cross-border and cross-border remittances FX. Humanitarian aid payments is another area where Circle specifically has had a number of pilots go live in the last few months, most notably with UNHCR, Stellar, and MoneyGram. We've been making and enabling the UNHCR to use USDC to make payments to those displaced in Ukraine by the conflict. And so they receive USDC in a Vibrant wallet operated by Stellar. They can walk into any MoneyGram anywhere and withdraw those funds in whatever currency they need. And obviously can continue to hold whatever they don't need to withdraw at that time safely on their Vibrant wallet. So that's just a couple of use cases that are, completely removed from the crypto capital markets use case. I think that we're also seeing an increase in consideration for how stablecoins will be used within the payment stack. So Visa, MasterCard, other traditional payment infrastructure rails are looking at incorporating things like USDC that are fully reserved stablecoins, so the fiat-backed algorithmic version of a stablecoin into essentially the Shopify experience. So, soon in the future, you will have the choice of checking out with your Visa, your MasterCard, your bank account, or your wallet that contains USDC. So I think that we're starting to move into this utility phase where we're moving away from, the initial intended use case of being able to facilitate the flow of value. I would agree with the earlier speaker that these fiat-backed reserved stablecoins do act as a platform for other types of dApps and businesses to build on top of and facilitate kind of frictionless movement of value. The second part of your question around 5 CBDCs that I'm excited about, I'm going to say I'm not really excited about any. And I don't think that there's 5 that are live. There might be a few in pilot. But for me, in those that are in pilot and those that are still in design, I think we still have a significant challenge to surmount privacy concerns. A number of these CBDCs are not being issued on open source technology. They're being on closed loop, which to me begs the question, what's the point? They won't be interoperable. They won't be exchangeable. So, that is not to say that I don't think that there is a use case for CBDCs, but I think it's at the wholesale level and not at the retail level, personally.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you're perfectly right, actually. From the latest numbers from the BIS, there's about, I think, 100 different CBDCs.
Like 138.
No, between 2023 and 2030. So they're actually in pilot processing. They're not still launched yet. And we're putting the finger on the major pain point here is how is the fight going to be taking place between stablecoins, which actually are working and are moving those liquidities through borders, and the CBDCs that are going to be coming in. So I was thinking to you for that one afterwards, Julien.
Just very quickly, let me address that. I would just want to challenge the premise that there's a fight. So every one of these panels that I sit on lately has been CBDCs versus stablecoins. We have a system of public and private money today, works very well. Now you can argue that the two-tier banking system disadvantages some, and there is a reason why we're implementing these decentralized financial technologies to increase access and to allow for more equitable distribution of wealth and value. But I don't think that it's a war, and I think that they will coexist. They will serve different use cases. And there is a potential, for example, the head of the New York DFS proposed that at some point in the future, if the US were to issue a CBDC, there would be no reason that CBDC couldn't be the backing asset for USDC, by example. So I challenge the premise that there's a war going on. I don't want to go to war with the central bankers, personally.
Please do challenge the premise. That's what the debate is for. Julien, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. This ecosystem has been trying to position DeFi as the system that will replace the current system. But to my opinion, DeFi and the different features that are empowering this technology will just enable to solve many different problems in CeFi. So what I believe is not necessarily like DeFi or stablecoin will become a major mean of like transferring different assets, but I think like CBDC will become, unfortunately, the biggest stablecoins in the ecosystem, because this is where the liquidity is, and they will be used as a collateral to some of the decentralized version of those stablecoins. I don't necessarily agree with the statement that all the CBDC today are not very good. I would say that I think one place that is very interesting to look at CBDC is Europe. Why? Because of GDPR and because of privacy first. I'm not saying that they will end up by building something that is serving people and retail first, because it's always a lot of lobbying. But if we normally look at building a new technology with the framework that is currently in place, which is, for example, GDPR, it's a framework in place to respect privacy for people and also end-to-end encryption. So normally this should be able and they should enforce the development of a CBDC that is close to something transparent, open source, not necessarily completely open source, but can actually serve the retail people and the people on the ground. So I think there is only one place in the world that I see the potential of using a CBDC that is as close as a stablecoin in a DeFi place is Europe. I don't see any other place.
Yeah, but the proposed digital euro today is not going to use open source technology as designed right now or in discussion. And it has a number of caveats for, yes, we'll put privacy preserving technology or safeguards in place, but they've yet to articulate how. Certainly not using any of the current technologies that we would be talking about, ZK, for example. There are transaction limits. So right now it's proposed that you can only hold 3,000 at any given moment. There's proposals where it's time limited. So if you don't use it, you lose it. Like, how does that work? That's not money. That's a gift card. I think that, I challenge that because I think that Europe has been working on this for some time. And we're now starting to see, leading into your political statement, a significant amount of backlash from numerous areas across the European Commission, parliamentarians, and even commercial banks that are very concerned about the current, plan of travel with the digital euro.
Which exactly emphasizes my point. I think the most advanced version of CBDC that is close to a stablecoin is in Europe. But, as you said, still shit. So meaning that the entire rest of the CBDC are shit. But the best of the shit is in Europe currently.
I think we have an end of the debate, ladies and gentlemen.
Just to say on the
This is the diplomatic version.
The voice of reason coming.
That was a diplomatic version.
No, but just to say that in Europe, there is actually, to me, 3 digital euro projects, because the current proposal are retail, and there is almost 2 versions of the retail. One is almost a PayPal app, and I agree with you, it's a bad imitation of what we have seen in the Web2 payment space in the last decades. It's a bit weird to see trying to do again the same thing. What's really bringing? But the problem is, as I said before, the central bank feels they're getting disconnected from what's happening in payment, and they are trying to find a solution. In the retail, although in the current proposal there is this offline payment that will be fully anonymous under limits, so I think some ideas that are dear to the crypto ecosystem, I think, are getting into the institution. There is enough people inside trying to push that. But the most important, and for our conversation, is there is another digital euro project that's the wholesale and still in a more early phase. And I think here they are getting really close to the vision that there is in DeFi. And the challenge is not necessarily the full traditional system and the central bank.
You said
DeFi.
Wallcoin?
Wholesale.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Was got scared.
And I think the challenge is also, as you say, the bank backlash against CBDC, but also because it's going to disintermediate them. So what I'm wondering is how much the crypto ecosystem could see CBDC as an opportunity to challenge a little bit how current financial system work. And I agree with you, it's not necessarily an opposition. On the contrary, I would even say that the best ally of DeFi at the moment are CBDC, because it's shaking the way things work. Otherwise, everything is owned and controlled. The infrastructure, the assets by the banks. And the CBDC is shaking this also.
Well, I think what it's doing too is causing central banks who have this, in my opinion, knee-jerk reaction, as you said, to diem, knee Libra, and the idea that we would, decentralize monetary sovereignty. The Europeans had a, very allergic reaction to that. However, if we're looking at the way that some of these CBDCs are proposed, we still need banks for some things, in my opinion, right? I mean, banks create credit. Stablecoin issuers like Circle do not. We're a reflection of the current monetary policy. We're referencing the fiat, the dollar or the euro. So in that case, I think that it has challenged them to think about how they will be able to kind of plug into not necessarily just a Web3 ecosystem, right, of on-chain 24-hour transactions. But all of the things that we don't yet know will be digitized, I guess, is a crappy way of saying it. But that next level, I think what the challenge is today, looking at it through the lens that they're looking at it, is a better version, like a faster horse, right, of the current horse that's pulling the cart today. If we're not going to reinvent the distribution of central bank money in a way that is constantly upgradable and that allows for interoperability, central banks will be in the same position that they are today. That's not going to change the velocity. And then from a commercial bank perspective, if CBDCs are capitalizing on commercial bank deposits, I think that is where those commercial banks are having significant concern, which goes back to, in a loop, the challenge around monetary stability and sovereignty. So I just don't think that they've figured it out. I think that's been a reaction.
Talking about infrastructure also as well and interoperability, really looking at it from a technological standpoint, Julien and Xavier, what are your thoughts on the most optimal way that we can make sure that stablecoins really circulate across borders without any friction, without going through bridges?
I think there are two different pieces of technology that completely change the view on CBDC and stablecoins and broader scope of the blockchain ecosystem. The first one is account abstractions, and the second one is one of the technology you mentioned, and I think it's zero knowledge proof. At the moment, central banks and regulators and all those guys are on the reaction phase where they're trying to not necessarily stop people from having better safety net or access to monetary system, but because they don't really necessarily understand, and it's not because they don't want, it's because they're not sufficiently educated in this ecosystem, because they already have a job, they already have a certain scope of understanding, and they are on a daily basis doing their own job. So for them to understand what we're building on our side, it's the same as us. We don't necessarily understand what's going on in the European Commission or on the international diplomacy level. So my point is, as soon as they start understanding the power of those different pieces, which is account abstraction, where you can not control, but not manipulate either, but interact with people's money, but guarantee that those people, they are always in the ownership of the asset that they have. And then secondly, if you can bring zero knowledge proof to make sure on the KYC and AML aspect of the regulatory framework, then you basically solve all the different issues. Because as you mentioned, I think that was a good point, we all need the current system. I think I saw like statistics where more than 90% of people using Twitter or TikTok or Facebook, they don't remember their password. So how can you tell billions of people in the world that not your key, not your money? I think this is good for less than 0.1% of the population worldwide, which is like geek and developers and people that really understand the underlying aspect of the technology we are building on top of. But for the rest of the people, we need the current system to help them be safe and also transact with those different tools. And the only way we can achieve this, as again, it was a good point, we're not in war. What we are is a war of knowledge, trying to educate people that those type of features are necessarily important for them to fight the current problems that they are facing, which is basically, I don't know, silver bank closing down, ATM being hacked on a daily basis, people stealing money. I think those type of features is not us trying to say, okay, please use DeFi, you need to use DeFi, because I think this is bullshit. What we need is like, look, we have built some features that are empowering DeFi, are using some very advanced mathematical and concept about game theory. I think you should adopt them. There's nothing to do with the thing that we're building in DeFi, if you don't want to, but it will solve a lot of your different problems. And as soon as they start adopting those different products, for us it's easier, because we can also connect in the zero knowledge proof KYC AML mechanism. You guarantee that those funds are used properly without actually knowing who's using those funds. You can also interact with people money without actually controlling the money. And then on cross-border, it's a miracle, because you can interact cross-border without necessarily going through or removing the concept of blockchain, which is anonymity and being able to control your own fund and etc.
On technology, I see your vision, and I think it's one path, but I'm not sure it's the fastest route. And I think there is an option, for instance, for stablecoin to be used for cross-border payment by just having, as you're experimenting, also intermediaries at the entry points, because the full technology vision is really hard to do, to implement. Even zero-knowledge proof, there is a lack of people manipulating it, able to build system, and also the lack of understanding of people might be. So there is a need of customer service, of different options. And I think at some point, maybe it's great that we work on this on one side, but I think we have to acknowledge that for a lot of scenarios, and especially the most, like in developing countries, people that are not literate enough or financially literate enough, you cannot ask them to understand account abstraction. So there needs to be maybe a customer.
It's not on the people level. It's completely abstract to them. It's nothing to do with that.
Yeah, but the other point maybe is the full infrastructure. And currently, DeFi use the public blockchain space. And I think what's the upcoming question is, we have all seen in the wave of purely private blockchain that totally failed. We can say that there's been a wave of project that has crashed. Everyone was saying it from the crypto ecosystem, and I think we were right. But there is a new wave that's happening of more public-private partnerships, larger scale projects that I think will have a spot. And I think it's really positive for the crypto ecosystem, because most of them are building on the technology that are used also in the crypto ecosystem and getting as close as possible. So maybe the next question to me in terms of technology, and the most pressing to me, is what's the different rules of different infrastructures? How much do we want to rely purely on this full anonymized, token incentivized technology? And to me, it's always something I say often is, the crypto ecosystem is always moving from the Bitcoin ideology ethos and hasn't found exactly where it wants to stop, right? Because at the other end of the spectrum, there is just becoming a new financial technology. And I think there is still some value that we want to retain, some open source you mentioned, some leveraging technology to making sure that some properties are guaranteed while preserving privacy. But I think in between, there is some match, 2 talks before, so there was this notion of like, we still need some form of intermediaries, how we can make them reliable. And I think this is where some of the conversation should move toward.
If I could just ladder off of 2 things, that one of which what you've said. So I think if you're referring back to the open source project that failed last year, I just want to say that if you're talking about Terra Luna, that to me was not a open source project. There was a number of kind of CeFi elements in there that were very highly controlled by one or several people. and that was not a
Open source-
stable coin.
Open source Ponzi.
Yeah, that was that was a hypothecated, highly leveraged derivative. That was not a stable coin, in my opinion. And then I think when you've mentioned SVB, I think that's a classic example of needing to separate the payments stack from the lending part of banking, right? So, you know, I said at the beginning that we still need banks to create credit and lend credit, and that's what, you know, an economy depends on. But one of the things that happened with SVB, there was, you know, discussion over the weekend about some of these small startups not being able to make payroll come the following week because their payments money, their operational deposits were locked up. And you know, was the money actually there because of this lending activity? So, you know, I think that that is a classic case of where you can separate out that payments activity, and I think that's what stablecoins are able to do really well from that other credit creation activity and lending activity. Now, central banks don't lend, but to date, in most parts of the world, they also don't serve retail. So if you're going to set up, you know, a digital version of your currency and send that through a series of intermediaries, to me, it seems like attack the wholesale interbank settlement issue with the CBDC and let commercial banks do what they do with greater segregation of payments activity and lending activity. I think we're trying to kind of fix the widget when the widget isn't actually the problem.
Actually, building on top of that and trying to shift away from the warfare and ideological warfare narrative between CBDCs and stablecoins, are there talks or schemes that are initiated to make sure that CBDCs, once they're not in pilot zone but actually fully in effect, are interoperable with some stablecoins?
Not at the moment, no. So I think there is consideration for that, and you know, we were talking about of the 130 plus discussion papers or exploratory projects around the world, how many of those are actually kind of in a design phase or a research phase? And the number's around 80, right? So of those 80, there is an acknowledgement that there will need to be an interoperability between private money, and what that private money looks like could be a variety of things. Could be stablecoins, could be tokenized deposits issued by a commercial bank. Don't get me started on those. It could
we still have time.
It could be CBDCs with another country, right? It could be the pound interacting with the digital euro, for example. So I think that they're considering these, but I haven't seen anything yet that's highly encouraging around being able to facilitate a global flow of payment.
But the problem between the connection between the two is not really technological. On the technological side, I've seen an improvement in the last years where I think the latest experiment, a lot of them are using a typical ERC20 trying. So technically it will be interoperable. Now the question is how much they would allow, for instance, stablecoin issuer. And
political problem.
Yeah, it's a political problem. I know in Europe, and I agree with Julien saying that Europe is probably not doing too bad on this, and basically they have announced that they consider opening central bank reserve to stablecoin issuers. So I think there is this sort of bridge is being considered. But often, and I don't fully understand, there is some sort of allergic reaction on if it's a stablecoin, it's bad and unstable. And even if they could provide the stability by just opening access to, for instance, CBDC as a reserve, that could be also a provable reserve, which is often a question we have with stablecoin. A CBDC could be something you could have almost on chain and being able to see. At the moment, there is a psychological lock on this.
Little gap. Actually, looking at who would be benefited the most if we look worldwide and we go a little bit more macro, between China and the digital renminbi, which have actually completely banned crypto usage and don't even want to hear about the term stablecoins, and Singapore, which has actually welcomed stablecoin with quite open arms and are trying to fit it into the regulation. What would you guys see being a fitting narrative from a business region or country that would just take on the lead and say, okay, we're going to open up the debates on regulations with stablecoin working hand in hand with CBDCs?
Well, I think the biggest winner of CBDCs, if it's well implemented, are the central banks, in a sense that people don't necessarily understand that normally central bank and governments are kind of like in partner, in relationship together, and they like each other. And the ones that don't really like each other are the central bank and the commercial banks, because, well, of course, central bank is the one issuing the money, and central bank are the one benefiting from sometimes free money and then distributing back to the retail people. So if the central bank are able to directly communicate and distribute that value down the ground to the people, then of course the lobby of banking are seeing this as a potential threat, but I don't think it shouldn't be seen like that. But yeah, the biggest winner in this with stablecoin and CBDCs are central bank and governments. It will be a very nice way and cheaper way for them to distribute money to people, and also creating credits and those type of remittance worldwide and cross borders. And of course, I'm not in favor of, I think, saying that money and different type of currency should be completely open source, transparent, and owned by everyone. I think this is nice in a world where you only have one country. But hers is composed of multiple different countries that they have their own diplomatic relationship and power of governance, and we usually say that your biggest friend is usually your biggest competitor. And if you look at US and Europe and Asia, you need domestic use of the money, because this is how you can control power. And controlling power is not something bad. It's something that you need in order to survive. You need strong power, strong currency. And if you look, Europe is in competition with US, is in competition with Asia, and vice versa. So CBDC should be isolated to domestic usage, but leverage outside in something that is easy accessible, because at the moment, if you price a barrel of oil in US dollars, then it's bad for Europe. And so that's, I think...
But why would you limit CBDC
I'm not saying
usage
limited. I'm
domestically when
I'm not
no
saying
other
limiting.
type of
I'm not saying
money is
limiting. I'm
limited?
saying it should be more accessible for people.
Why?
Because this is how you can control power.
Okay, but think about it this way. So one of the reasons that the US dollar is so powerful and the US is so powerful is because it's a global reference currency. They export their currency. So what you're saying is that the digital euro would be stronger because you make it domestic only?
I will find a different word of exporting. I will replace this word by something more aggressive than exporting. But no, I'm not saying.
But you're not. You don't want the digital euro to be exported at all.
No, I want digital euro to be exported, but
No,
I also want to benefit. I want
domestic.
benefits more the people in Europe, the same that any country will do.
So we're going back more onto the index on which the major issuer is going to be on. For example, if it's the US dollar, or if it's the renminbi, or if it's the euro that's going to take on the lead. Is that what you mean?
CBDC will become the sovereignty tool that can maintain power in those different countries. So of course, if Europe issue a euro stablecoin, you want this tool to be used as a way to regain sovereignty across the globe. I mean, it's not something stupid.
So I guess what I'm saying is, if you're looking, most of the political concerns around the digital yuan are because it's exporting, offshoring Chinese monetary policy. And with that comes a whole host of concerns around data protection and privacy, et cetera, et cetera.
Gross market CBDCs.
Right. Again, the dollarization of the world is, we're kind of moving from the globalization period that we experienced over the last kind of 25 years into a more localized political mindset. And the dollar being the reference currency of the world, something like 79% of global trade is settled in dollars. So dollars are what is being used to transact globally. So if we're thinking ahead into this Web3 environment and the currency of the internet, the way to maintain power would be to export a currency, your national currency, out into the world and make it available to be used at the speed of the internet, not control your people with that. I don't.
But
maybe I'm
This is not my point.
misunderstanding.
This is not my point.
But
Well, that's what you said.
But for most countries, the challenge at the moment is not even to export their money; it's just to make sure that people in their country use their money, because
Yeah, but
most of the
again,
countries
so
are
that
getting
so the,
hammered by the dollar, and as there is stablecoins, as there is more and more easy flow cross border, as you say, like there is this network effect and so on, and they are at risk. And yes, China probably has a play, and from the US perspective is seen as a threat because they could become a regional currency and so on, but it's also them playing a counterbalance, because otherwise you don't have any option for.
Oh, I completely agree that that Europe having a CBDC does benefit Europe, no question, and somehow, in some ways, can protect against or prevent continued dollarization, right? So for sure. But let's just keep in mind that Europe has no national or endemically European payment rails today, none. So Visa, MasterCard, everything that we use to move money around is not European in nature, not controlled by Europe. So I can see why the ECB wants a CBDC. It makes perfect sense to me. However, I think you both touched on two things, and that is adoption. So if you can't design something that's easy for people to use and they feel comfortable using, they'll just keep using Visa. They won't use it. And so if people don't adopt it, then it's dead.
Yeah, I fully agree that the design is key. And I think, going back to your question of what countries are doing well, to me, for instance, two examples that strike out are India and Brazil, because they have solved the payment systems. And they have, so PIX and UPI, so it's two fast payment systems with a really clear API, designed with different stakeholders, so even like Google is plugged into it, and actually one of the big actors, so it's back a problem of sovereignty. But they have also made it mandatory with some caps, for instance, in India, to allow other payment providers to participate. And because they have this payment system in the mobile phone that works
But they allow private sector to plug into UPI.
Yeah.
So I think that's the key.
Yeah, it's a very private-oriented approach that I think they have designed well. And often CBDC, maybe it's what you're applying, are trying, the government or the central bank trying to do everything, all the payment rail, and maybe it's difficult to see them achieve a better in the end than the competition of, and especially a public-private partnership where the government guarantees the main function, ensures the standardization, and then the private actor competes. But just to finish on those two examples, what I think is interesting is because they have solved the payment problem, then their CBDC are way more advanced. And especially in Brazil, they are designing basically a DeFi blockchain. So I've seen some backlash on Twitter I didn't understood, because what they are trying to do is just make a blockchain with different actors that will be able to do all sorts of DeFi-like operation, and the central bank would just provide the money in this blockchain. It's still an experiment. We don't know where it's going to go, and they're opening for different actors, but they can do more advanced stuff because they have solved the payment problem, so they are not encumbered with having to solve different issues at the same time.
I think you have multiple different countries that have successfully implemented different version of Visa or MasterCard, which is the SWIFT network. Like, for example, in Portugal, you have a system called Multibanco. And a country pretty big, China, they use WeChat and a few different things like that. So my point is saying that US dollar is used across the globe as main currency is because people love US dollars?
No, that's not what I said.
Okay, let me finish. So first one, okay, this is not what you said. Okay.
At all.
Good, yes, because trust me, if you tell that to European Commission or something, just like, well, guess what? Those people in the rest of the world.
I've lived here for 20 years.
Let me finish.
I'm just telling you how it is, not what I think.
The people in the rest of the world are forced to use US dollars. That's the reality. It's not because they love it. It's because they are forced to do.
To douse the fire maybe a little bit, and taking a page out of the actual economic standpoint, on the 15th of August, the BRICS, new digital currency also, and they're launching a currency indexed on gold. It's going to be launched on the 15th. We still don't know what it's going to be looking like or whatever form it's going to take, but it's going to be a...
Nice. Well, we have someone who's got some big gold bar in his room.
So maybe we're...
But my point is, what is happening in Asia, or especially, like, I think what they have in China is interesting. Not on the privacy level, but on the way that they have built their own system. Same with Brazil, same with Portugal. And I think with the CBDC, what will happen is complete isolated, not isolated in the sense of not being able to distribute and people to have access to, but to, for example, European, its own network, interact transparently or easily with other networks, such as maybe Swift American network, or other networks. That's what I think will happen in order to maintain power. And this is not me saying we need power, it's because this is how civilizations survive. And
Swift
governance.
is based in Switzerland. It's not American. Swift.
No, I mean like people behind the network.
I think we're looking at a problem on who's governing and who has a liquidity, which is a time-old problem that we're maybe not going to be able to resolve right now. But if we go back to CBDCs across borders and stablecoins, so far we're looking at success stories on digital payment implementation. Then if the UX works, we can get into mass market adoption, and that's when we would need to be able to connect CBDCs and stablecoin together to really make the liquidities flow. So since I'm seeing the time turn out, if ever we could get some lovely insights from you three on what hopeful future we could have tomorrow, if ever we could really implement stable, fluid liquidity with stablecoin across worldwide usage.
Well, I think for a start, one of the things that we could do today that would provide a level of trust and transparency that would encourage greater adoption, and I don't mean necessarily maybe at the retail level, but more at a wholesale level where it could be exponentially more beneficial, would be to enable stablecoin issuers to be, one, prudentially regulated, and two, hold their reserves at their national central bank. So if I'm going to issue a digital euro, then I would have my reserves at a European Central Bank of France, for example. In the UK, the payment institutions are allowed to have accounts at central banks, so that's a potential, given that the UK has just passed legislation that will bring stablecoins into the regulated perimeter, probably at about the same time that MiCA comes into force next year in July, regulating stablecoins in Europe as well. So, I think those are timed interestingly. But in that case, then you would have potentially, as a policymaker, a greater comfort that the reserves are being held in assets and in a way that you feel is confident. And then if you're plugging into the existing financial ecosystem or payment rails, you wouldn't necessarily have a need for a CBDC issued by the government because you would have open source, interoperable, internet-ready, digitally native pounds or euros ready to plug into the system today.
Or dies.
Yeah, dies might be a little different because there's a basket, but...
Another debate.
On this, that would be lovely if every central bank reserve could be open to more actors. I know that one limitation is basically the infrastructure they have. So it's comfortable for them to say, okay, we only allow the major banks to access because then you have fewer clients, you have fewer mess to. So there is a question of scaling the infrastructures, being able to onboard more people, and that's why also they are looking at CBDC, sometimes just as an opportunity to refresh some of their infrastructure and try to have something more robust and more easily opened, because currently the main strategy for security is to have barriers. But I think you highlighting the main challenge is, if I'm the European Central Bank, what I want is every euro to be €1, and everything that's not €1 to be clear that it's not €1, and that's currently the debate about stablecoin. Is it really €1, and as sure as any other euro circulating in the economy or not? And I think that the component you are saying are the right one. It's a question of what's the banking, what's the regulation of every institution that's allowed to issue what we would consider a euro. But maybe there is also a question on in which infrastructure it circulates, because then what happens with it and so on.
But let me just give you an example of where that's not currently going to work. So within the MiCA provisions, you need to hold 30% of your reserves in a credit institution. And as we just saw with SVB, credit institutions don't always do a great job of doing what they're supposed to do. So in the event of a challenge at a credit institution like Credit Suisse, and there's a collapse, and a stablecoin issuer has 30% of their reserves on deposit there, what happens then? Very different situation if I have it on deposit at the ECB or Bank of France.
If I can answer your question before we finish the panel, I think there's, and I understand the regulators and the governments moving slowly in this topic, because if you look, especially in Europe, it's kind of seen as a threat, because look, today, look at this video, potentially everyone's laptop are all using what we call in Europe GAFA. Google, Amazon, Facebook, and also potentially Twitter. And what's left for those governments, such as in Europe, is money. So I think there's a right for them to still be able to use money in such a way to maintain their sovereignty. And so welcoming any partners or any wants to play on a European level, it has to be seen as a really difficult game. Of course, we want to open, we want to be borderless, we want to make more people access those different values, but at the same time, we also need to make sure we don't get the value sucked outside of our own, for example, Europe here, into another jurisdiction or another country, because this is exactly what's happening today. And we have, over the past 30 years, 40 years, now we are using tools that are not being built here or used by the people or actually built, and then the value correctly stay in Europe. So yeah, it's a risk. And we have to build in accordance of what we want to see in a near, short, medium, or long-term future of Europe, if we're talking for Europe. But same for Asia and same for the US.
And just one idea to make sure that they move a bit faster, the best idea would be to have more central bankers come to the next edition of this Stable Summit to engage with this community.
Yeah, please welcome to Stable coming next year.
Please come and debate. Well, guys, thank you so much, and lots of food for thought. Give a big round of applause, everybody.
Great panel, guys. And I think we're going to do some questions.
Oh.
Yeah.
Get back here, please.
Hey, great job, guys. Some quotable moments today. I really
So many
thought
hands up.
everybody loved the dollar, though. I don't know.
My question is around the weaponization of the dollar. So when you look at the Treasury Department, it's gone from basically regulatory to now an enforcement agency. So you have Jeff that runs OFAC, and then you have Jeffrey Sonfeld out of Yale and his organization that provides all the information to the people to OFAC on who to stop around the world. And there's no court, it's just arbitrary if he likes you or not. Do you see CBCs going in direction of more weaponization, more enforcement to countries and to individuals?
No, I don't think so. I think what the intention of CBDC to do, looking future forward, is to, as Julian said, one of the things that countries are trying to ensure that they're controlling their own monetary policy, right? And that they're able to use those levers in times of conflict and war and inflation, et cetera. And the dollar as a weapon, I think, sanctions, for example, is one of those things where, because the dollar is so prolific in the value trade of global trade, right? It has become the reference or reference currency of the world. I think that if more countries in the euro is the second largest, currency in the world, were better able to export the euro for use in those types of activities, then that would start to balance out that power. What you're seeing in the US, and again, I'm not supporting this, I'm just telling you the way that it is, is this attempt to hang on to that power that the US believes that it has. And it has very little to do with Europe and has a lot to do with China. And to some extent Russia and the relationship that China and Russia have. So I think that, in my opinion, if we had another way of solving some of that global flow, and not just at a retail level, but at that kind of cross-border institutional settlement level, then the power would be shared more equitably than perhaps it is today.
And another way of answering it is, you're saying it's a bit arbitrary the way it's chosen, but I think it's what even worse is because of the implementation is not certain. A lot of countries, banks are scared of sanctions and not applying well the sanction. And so you have all these even entire countries that are on a gray list, and banks cannot have a relationship with other banks just because they might be suspicious somehow. So maybe the question is, how much is it a question of should we avoid to have any of this power regarding to money, or if it exists, should it be more transparent at when we decide who should have a sanction? So maybe there should be a better governance around taking those decisions. But then if the implementation is a bit leaner, I think in the end it would reduce some cost, because anyway, people that are the most hurt are people that are not retargeted, but everyone that's a bit around and caught in this too wide net. And I think that's the main problem we have today.
Okay, I think we got time for two more, and there's a lot of hands, so I'm sorry if it doesn't get to you.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting, the panel. I have a point to ask, because I see that the conversation around the topic of CBDCs many times goes around the focus of privacy, like they don't respect privacy. How do we do that they respect privacy? And I really much resonate with what Julian said. Technically, that can be solved, like putting a layer of cryptography, CK proofs on top, and that's okay. But my main concern is not just around privacy. I think that the major threat is on programmability. If you have money issued by a central institution, it's a direct liability of them, and you put on top of that a layer of programmability. You can program what you can do with that token, with that asset. You can program you can put contingent rules on what that money can be consumed or not, and etc. Anything that we know in smart contracts can be designed. So if they control the payment system, basically, if you go to the BIS website, you want to see that they're launching a payment API, and they enforce that, and that tracks metadata. And that metadata is what they use for enforcing those smart contracts. And basically, your freedom is out. So my main concern is that, like, the same when you program what you can consume, you can program in a token where the token not to go. Basically, it cannot go to this exchange, it cannot go to these off-ramps, etc. And as you may have written all these reports, they're using UTXOs, not account-based systems. Basically, the programmability goes straight to the token. So which are your opinions around this topic? I mean, it's okay that we all think that CBDCs are cool and they are the liability of the central bank. And
I don't think
maybe
we all do.
But maybe we have to. I mean, that's one question.
Question is, there's many more questions, so
I have another point that I want to help with.
Is it a question?
No, which are the that's the question. Which are your views around?
okay.
Great,
so
thanks. We got it.
Thank
Go.
you. Well, I will make it quick. I think the implementation of those rules at the protocol level is very, very, very bad, and should never happen. Because, for example, we have on a daily usage, daily life, we use knife. There's not a cop next to us to make sure the knife we use is to cut a piece of meat. My point is, we on the protocol level, need to have a technology that is sufficiently safe, but without any gates, and is not the one saying, okay, this token cannot be sent to this specific location, but it's the job of the regulators, the legal task enforcement firms to monitor and to make sure that those people that are interacting and doing those things are caught. Because this is how you can protect freedom. And you don't build freedom by putting people in cage. This is not possible.
I agree. I think that you're right to have those concerns. That's probably actually my top concern, the programmability aspect. If we're going to replace cash or supplement cash with a digital version, then it should operate like cash. And if you ask any central banker today about creating banknotes and giving them to people and let them make anonymous payments anywhere in the world, they would not let us do that. So there wouldn't be cash today. I think that one of the things that we could do, and I know I'm going to sound a bit like a Pollyanna, but the CBDC consultation that was just issued by the Bank of England had something like 50,000 responses to it. And a lot of those came from individual people, not policy people like me, that basically raised questions about those very same things. So I think if we're going to replace cash, and the central bank is meant to serve the people, to provide us with currency to be able to transact, then we should demand from them exactly what we will accept and what we won't.
Yeah, but because the most important is the possibility is there. There is no way of creating a new system and not having the capability of do some programmability. And now the question is, it's a governance question. What we agree on constraints that happen before you make the payment and how much should be controlled after. Also, what's new is with new system, we can have better data, monitor better, which is a privacy problem, but also could be a good way to say we let more things to happen and we have, like it happened in the blockchain ecosystem, and we have enough data to know after and make an inquiry. So, but it's going to be a really tough governance challenge, and you're right of mentioning consultation paper, because I think central banks are asking for feedback, and it's the right moment to show and express this concern, and also it will be political at some point. At some point there will be election that will be run with partly these kind of issues, and I think that's the kind of thing where you cannot be only a technologist and at some point go to the governance part.
On a research standpoint, you've got the BISIH, so the BIS International Innovation Hub, where they're doing lots of inside pilots on CBDCs. And if ever you want to look and delve a little bit more into the details of that, I would definitely counsel looking that up. Do we have one last question? Do we have time for one last? No? Oh, so one big meaty last question.
We have to go to lunch because everybody's hungry. But thanks, folks, for a great panel. And let's give them one more round of applause. It is lunchtime now, but we'll be back here at 1:30 p.m. with a panel about adoption.
Thank you very much, guys. Thanks again.
So inspiring. Would you mind if I just